Hello, I'm Tom Duncan. I've been the Clerk of the Legislative Assembly for the Australian Capital Territory for over 20 years. In this short video, I will talk about the CPA's recommended benchmarks for Democratic Legislatures, what they are, how they can be applied, and using them to improve our democratic practice. During my time working in parliaments, I've developed an ongoing interest in understanding how we can tell if a legislature is doing its job properly. And I wondered what measures might give us a sense of whether the legislative branch of government is performing its legislative, accountability and representative functions to a reasonable standard. In thinking about these questions, I was drawn to the CPA's recommended benchmarks for democratic legislatures when they first came out in 2006. The ACT Legislative Assembly was the first legislature to undertake an assessment against these benchmarks back in 2008. We conducted another assessment in 2019. Off the back of that experience, I recently have had the pleasure of assisting CPA branches in the Pacific region to undertake assessments. I've also assisted in developing initiatives to help meet certain benchmarks following an assessment of another parliament in the Caribbean region. I'll briefly explain what's in the benchmarks, how assessments can be conducted, and why they might be of use. So what are the benchmarks? The benchmarks were first developed through a study group hosted by the Bermuda Legislature on behalf of the CPA and the World Bank Institute, with support from the United Nations Development Programme, the European Parliament, and the National Democratic Institute for International Affairs. While all legislatures are different, there are certain characteristics that make a legislature a democratic one. At their core, legislatures are responsible for considering and passing laws, for representing their communities, and for scrutinising executive government and holding it to account. How well they are able to perform these functions depend on how they are constituted, the powers that they have, the independence that they enjoy, and their own standards of ethical conduct. For example, are members elected through free elections with universal suffrage? Is eligibility to stand as a candidate free from discrimination? Does the freedom of speech immunity protect members and the legislature? Do committees have the power to summon persons, papers and records to ensure government scrutiny can be carried out? Are staff of the legislature non-partisan and independent? Is the Parliament responsible for the passage of the budget? And is there a code of conduct for members of the legislature? There were 87 benchmarks published in 2006. I was involved in reviewing and revising the benchmarks as part of a 2018 CPA study group. Following the review, the benchmarks were increased and expanded in scope. So why undertake a benchmark assessment? Legislatures do not always have the time to take the long-term view of their work and how they operate. It can be useful to our democratic practice to take time away from the day-to-day political environment and to think about what is working well and where we might be able to do better to live up to democratic ideals. By examining the assessments of other CPA member legislatures, we can also identify solutions to common problems or gaps in our democratic practice. At its best, the assessment process can be used to drive positive democratic reform of parliamentary institutions. So what does an assessment involve? An assessment against the benchmark starts off in most cases with the presiding officer and clerk agreeing to start the process. Both of these officers should play a key role in any assessment, but beyond that, there are many ways to proceed. What was our experience? In the Legislative Assembly's most recent assessment in 2019, we adopted a process by which I, along with another senior parliamentary officer, assessed our performance against each benchmark to determine how well we performed. By examining our legislation, standing orders and parliamentary practice, we considered whether we fully met or partially met the benchmark, or whether we met the benchmark at all. For each assessment, we prepared commentary explaining how the assessment was derived, referring directly to how our arrangement did or did not meet the benchmark. We then sought an independent peer review of our assessments by an eminent Australian political science academic. We took on board his observations and amended the assessments accordingly. The assessment was then considered by and endorsed by an all-party committee of the Legislative Assembly. You can read the assessment on the benchmarking section of the CPA website, along with a number of other assessments that have been undertaken by CPA member legislatures. Legislatures may seek CPA assistance to undertake an assessment against the benchmarks. There is a benchmarking workbook prepared by the CPA, which relevant officials from the CPA branch being assessed first complete. This is then followed up by a site visit by CPA staff and experienced practitioners to go over the assessment. In addition to working through benchmarking workbooks, the assessment meets a wide range of people involved in the parliamentary process. These include both the presiding officer and clerk, government, opposition and crossbench members, committee chairs and secretaries. In addition to these key persons, the team also talks to members of civil society, the media, key office holders like the Auditor General and the Electoral Commissioner, all who have an important role to play and that affect the benchmarks. The assessment takes all of this information in and then produces a report on how the benchmarks are being met and identifying any areas of improvement. It is not a time-consuming exercise. I have assisted both the Kiribati and the Tongan parliaments in undertaking the assessment process, and the fieldwork usually takes several days with parliamentarians and officials. A report is then drafted by the assessment team in the next few months following consultation with the legislature being assessed, and following their agreement, it's published. You will see many of these assessments on the CPA website. What benefits can flow following an assessment? It's important to note that it is unlikely that any legislature will meet every aspect of each of the benchmarks. The main benefit of undertaking an assessment is that it can identify where reform efforts might best be directed towards improving democratic practice. The outcomes of an assessment can also be used as a roadmap to receive technical assistance from the CPA to implement any proposed reforms. This happened recently with the legislature of Anguilla, when, as part of the assessment process, it identified the need for a code of conduct for members and a regime to declare members' interests. To assist, and on behalf of the CPA, I travelled to Anguilla to meet with elected representatives and officials from that legislature and assisted in further developing those arrangements. Similarly, when we undertook our first assessment for the ACT Legislative Assembly in 2008, we identified that we did not refer all bills to committees and that the parliamentary service was not sufficiently independent of government. The benchmarking process allowed us to examine these issues more closely, and since that time, we've been able to reform our legislation and our standing orders to achieve both of those benchmarks. I would encourage all legislatures with an interest in continuous improvement and democratic strengthening to consider undertaking an assessment against the CPA recommended benchmarks. Whether done as a self-assessment or with assistance from the CPA, the assessment process is a good way of understanding your stronger and weaker areas of democratic practice and thinking about ways that create stronger and a more resilient legislature.